Right. So my name is Liepa. I haven't done debating in a while. I did debating for, I think, 7 or 8 years. I was representing Kaunas Jesuit Gymnasium. Then I represented Lithuania in WSDC from 2018 to 2020. Then I coached for a bit, and here I am now. I'm currently working as an externally hired communication assistant in the European Commission representation here in Vilnius. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a lot of European institutions, a lot of EU lawmaking. We have a lot of papers to go through. I know that EU lawmaking may not be in its own a very exciting topic, so to say. So I'm going to try to be as concise as possible to make this very simple, to make this very clear, to make this somewhat entertaining so you can apply this information in your debates. Right, so without further ado, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. Can somebody confirm whether you guys can see what I'm showing? Audibly, preferably.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Right, so let's get right into it. We're going to talk about how EU institutions work and in general how EU laws are made. I have a brief plan for today. So first things first, we're going to talk about a little bit more in detail about some key institutions that we have here in the EU. I'm not going to go for all of them. I'm just talking about the main guys that you need to understand how they work. Then we're going to talk about how EU lawmaking works in general and how different laws differ and why that matters and why it's important. And then hopefully you can apply this information in a debate. So first things first, the EU generally has 7 official institutions of the European Union, right? Naturally, it's the European Commission, the Parliament. Then you've got these 2 guys called the European Council and Council of the EU. They look very similar. They're named very similarly, but they do completely different things. And these 4 guys are mainly responsible for the lawmaking process and the direction that the EU takes in the world. But then you've got these 3 other institutions, the Court of Justice of the EU, European Central Bank, and the European Court of Auditors, which sort of complement the actions of the first 4. But like additionally to that, the EU really doesn't end with these guys. You have additional 9 EU bodies. These are the things like the European Economic Social Committee, the European Committee for Regions. Then you've got over 30 decentralized agencies, which are split across the European Union. These are things like the European Medicines Agency in Amsterdam. And in all of these institutions, you have 60,000 EU civil servants working, right? So quite a bit of people, but when you think about it, it's really not that much because in comparison, if even in Lithuania, a country relatively small to compare to some EU members, we've got more civil servants and quite a bit more. So technically, the laws and all of that process lies on hands of not that many people that do their best to represent the European citizens. First things first, since we've got the commission open here, I think we need to talk about what it is, what it does, and how it generally functions. So the EU Commission is comprised of 27 commissioners. The way this works is that each member state selects an individual who serves as a member of the European Commission College, right? A new College of Commissioners is elected every 5 years. We probably, as you know, have a pretty new commission currently. The current college started its work in December 2024. And not that long ago, they had this important thing called the 100 days of the commission, which is like the first 100 days of the college where they try to do a lot of work and like set up the path for the next 5 years. So the president of the commission is Ursula von der Leyen. She is a German politician. It's quite impressive. She is the first female president of the European Commission in its history. And at the same time, she's serving for the 2nd term now. Aside from that, you've got each commissioner who is responsible for a specific policy area, right? And these differ vastly. This can be education, this can be anti-corruption, youth empowerment, labor rights, regional cohesion, etc., etc. And Lithuania plays quite an important role for this college because in 2024-2029, we've got Andrius Kubilius as our commissioner, who is serving as a commissioner for space and defense, something that is really, really important in this day. The thing you need to note here is that each commissioner, when they enter office, they sort of do this pledge of allegiance, like oath of allegiance. And the thing that the thing that this means is basically that by becoming a commissioner, they're no longer serving their country, right? So they completely basically focus all of their attention and all of their priorities on the general well-being of the EU, right? So they cannot be acting in the interest of their own state, they're acting in the interest of the EU as a whole. In general, if you look at the commission as a whole, right, like there's quite a bit of people working there, and you've got 34 things called directorate generates. So directorate generals are these things that basically focus on a specific interest, policy, or activity area of the commission, right? And these also vary broadly, right? You've got the Directorate of Communications, of Agriculture, of Environment, of Human Rights, of Environment and Competition, like loads of different things. And all of these directorates, they include dozens and like literally thousands of people working on specific issues to make sure that like the laws pass and like that the right reforms are taken. So each member state also has an EC representation located in its territory, and some countries actually happen to have more than one. So for instance, in Italy, there's more than one European Commission representation given the size of the state. In general, the European Commission is comprised of more than 60 buildings, and it has more than 30,000 employees. So things can get pretty heated and there's a lot of action happening at all times, right? This picture over here, we can showcase with this the new European Commission College. The thing I'd like you to pay attention to is that, well, obviously, you know, Andrius Kubilius, the Lithuanian commissioner, has taken up quite an important space, is quite an important portfolio given today's geopolitical situation, defense and space, right? But on the right, you're going to see Kaja Kallas, who is the foreign affairs and security policy sort of person responsible for it. And she's working directly with Ursula because she's her vice president, right? So it's pretty important that what you have in this day's commission and in this day's college is that you have a high prevalence of Eastern and Nordic European representatives serving in areas of defense, security, and resilience, right? That's something to keep in mind, something to maybe keep in mind in your next debate if you ever have a topic related to that. But the reason I'm showing you all this, and the thing I want to show you, the thing I'd like you to understand is basically that each commissioner is responsible for a separate portfolio. And the portfolio is a term that refers to an area of responsibility. So as you can see, if you look at the whole map, there's a lot of very, very different things. You know, like you have Dubravka Šuica focusing on Mediterranean affairs. You've got Jessica Roswell, who's a brilliant environment commissioner and stuff like that. So really a large area of different expertise. The European Commission as a whole, prior to its start, like once it starts working as a college, it does this thing, it lays out the key priorities for its next 5 years. Now, I'm not going to go too in depth in this because I'm pretty sure, well, I know that you recently had a workshop carried out by Justinas Mickus who explained this new political path. But basically, the thing I would like you to note here is that for the first time in history, there is a very clearly sort of stated role of democracy and people's like values and all of that, specifically in the priorities of the commission. It usually tended to be more like, so to say, tangible aspects. And now you have all these things like, you know, the European way of life, the protection of democracy, the upholding of our values and all like that, all of these things. So that's something to pay attention to. Another thing is obviously, for the first time, you've got European defense and security as one of the key policy areas and key priorities. So that's also important. But there's also a lot of things happening when we talk about sustainability and competitiveness. So obviously, naturally, throughout the years, each college had focused a lot on, you know, making Europe, so to say, perform economically, be competitive and all that. But this year, a large emphasis is placed on making sure that our economic growth is sustainable, but more importantly, that we can become competitive in some areas that we're currently lacking in, such as, for instance, artificial intelligence, right? So in comparison to past commission priorities, I'd say that the current college quite stands out with how unusual some of these are. Right. In terms of what the European Commission does, right? So the European Commission has the role of proposing new legislation. But aside from that, it's also the organ that manages EU policies and that allocates EU funding. It enforces EU law in member states. It makes sure that member states comply and that they're actually taking care of things properly. And simultaneously, the European Commission is responsible for representing the EU internationally and negotiating international agreements, which is exactly the reason why you'll see, Ursula von der Leyen in talks with Donald Trump and other international characters, because she's the one representing the Commission and Europe as a whole. Now that we've established that, we can move on to the European Parliament and the way it works, right? So a lot of numbers here, a lot of information to take in, but I'll try to simplify this for you guys. So since 1979, members of the European Parliament have been elected by direct universal suffrage for a 5-year period, right? And each country sort of decides on how this election is going to look inside it. But all electoral systems are based on proportional representation, which means that the number of members of parliament elected from a political party is proportional to the number of votes it receives. And the number of MEPs elected from each country is agreed before each election and is based on this principle of digressive proportionality, which basically means that, the bigger the country, the more people it has, larger the territory, the more MEPs it's going to have. However, we have this general rule that applies. So no country can have less than 6 representatives within the European Parliament. So, regardless of the fact that Malta is so many times, like smaller than Germany, it's still at all costs going to have at least 6 members of parliament present. Prior to each election, it's actually decided how many MEPs there are going to be there. So this number of like for instance, currently, we have 720 members of parliament, but this number really varies in each election and a different number is decided. The key rule here is that this number of members of parliament cannot exceed 750. In the case of the current parliament, Lithuania currently has 11 members of parliament. And yeah, that's basically it. And the current president of the parliament is this woman named Roberta Metsola. She's Maltese. She's a Maltese politician. So yeah, a little bit about the parties, because probably, as you know, when the parliamentarians go into the EP, they are also joining like a sort of specific party that represents their interests. Now you have 8 political groups, and you can see their list here, right? But these are ranked by size. So I'm going to go over them briefly, just so you get the grasp of what these parties do, what is their key ideology, how do they differ between each other. So first things first, you have the group of the European People's Party, the EPP. This is basically the Christian Democrats. So this tends to be more like a center-right group. And the EPP has been the largest group in the parliament since, I believe, 1999. So the EPP is strongly pro-European. It favors integration. This group stands for having, a strong common market that acts competitively and that can be competitive on an international stage as well. And in general, it values sustainable development and the welfare of citizens and sort of this citizen-centered European democracy, right? Then following that, you have the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. There isn't much to explain here because it's pretty much similar to any social democrat party that you have in any other country, right? It consists, this whole party, of representatives of social democratic and labor parties. Their attention is mostly given to an inclusive European society based on equality, solidarity, and justice, and in addition on improving living and working conditions of its people. Then you've got this party called the Patriots, and this is the first time that a party that is right-wing is in sort of like such a high position, because before the third biggest party, I believe, used to be Renew instead of the Patriots, but yeah. So the Patriots are radical right. They promote strict immigration policies and sort of cultural preservation. When you think of the Patriots, think about Fidesz and Hungarian politics. Think about I don't know, Matteo Salvini a little bit and all of that. All of these guys who tend to be conservative, anti-immigration, all of that stuff. Right after that, you've got European conservatives and reformists. So naturally, these are just comprised of a lot of conservative party members. They tend to be center-right. They're like a combination of social conservatives and supporters of economic liberalism. They're not outright Eurosceptic, but they are a little bit iffy when it comes to European cooperation and are not, so to say, fully supportive of it. More importantly, these guys tend to emphasize economic cooperation and free trade, but they wish to like restrict cooperation in other areas. So they're more like sort of economics focused. We can say it like that. Right. Then you've got Renew Europe, or just Renew. The core values of them are democracy, sustainability, prosperity. They want to focus on things such as personal freedoms, free enterprise, social solidarity. It's basically like, like the most key and fundamental, like liberal priorities and principles, so to say. Then you've got the Greens and the European Free Alliance. As the title says, this is an alliance, so there were two parties that merged. Within the group of Greens and EFA, human rights and environment are central, and basically they represent each party. The Greens are the ones who always push for more sustainable reforms, for environmental protection and all of that. And then the European Free Alliance tends to be the one that's pushing more for equality, solidarity, like better human rights and all that. Then you've got the left, pretty self-explanatory, not much to say here. They are like very left-wing, they're anti-capitalist. If you look into their political agenda, they tend to emphasize things like workers' rights, economic justice, environmental protection as well. And then you've got the ESN, the sovereignists. So these are ultranational, conservative, far-right politicians. Their goal is basically to restore sovereignty and self-determination to European nations. They basically go upon this belief that, well, even though we are part of the EU and stuff, each country must remain sovereign and like have its like sort of cultural divisions and like showcase that it's still independent and all that jazz. So yeah. All right. So now that we've established that, we can go on to the committees. And the committees are a pretty interesting and important thing. So the members of the parliament are divided among 26 committees. At the start of every new legislature, Parliament decides which members will sit in which committee. And the size of the committee can vary. It can range from 25 to 90 members. But basically, their role is this. So these committees instruct legislative proposals through the adoption of reports. They propose amendments to the plenary. They can appoint a negotiation team to conduct negotiations with the council on EU legislation and all of that. And they can also adopt like their own reports and organize hearings with experts and this kind of business. So basically, their role is like partaking actively in these plenary meetings, and they all specialize in a specific area of importance, right? Each committee elects a chair and up to 4 vice chairs. So this kind of forms like this committee bureau. And they stay in power, like they stay in the leadership for a period of 2.5 years. But the parliament can also set up subcommittees and special temporary committees. And this is something I'd like you to pay attention to, because sure, you're always going to have committees on things like, fisheries or human rights and agriculture, like things that are always consistently equally important throughout the years. But for instance, this year we have 2 special committees. One of them is the housing crisis in the EU committee, basically, just as the name says, focusing on the fact that buying property in the EU has become almost impossible nowadays. There's a lot of obstacles for young families and all of that. So they're trying to work on reforms on that. And then you've got the committee that is the European Democracy Shield Committee, right? So once again, we're emphasizing the democracy and like our equal values. Just as I said for like the Commission's priorities, right? Lastly, you've got the delegations, and there's 48 of them, right? So these interparliamentary delegations, they're basically standing bodies of parliament comprising groups of MEPs that officially maintain and further deepen relations with the parliaments of non-EU countries, other regions, and organizations, right? Every single MEP has to be a member of a standing delegation, and at times they can actually be a member of more than one delegation. And they actually very closely cooperate with the committees, specifically some of them, because, for instance, when we come back to the topic of committees, you have things such as the Committee on Foreign Affairs. So this committee will be closely cooperating with delegations such as the Ukraine delegation, the Turkey delegation, and so on and so forth. So basically, the goal of these guys is to deepen EU's external relations with other partners, to look for partners, and to sort of strengthen their position on international arena. Right. So in case you're interested, This is the current like sort of chart of how the seats are looking like. You can see that EPP is at the top, followed by Social Democrats and then the Patriots. The one thing you're going to notice here is this thing called NI. These are sort of the non-attached individuals, right? So basically what this means is that not all members of the parliament are part of a political group. So these members are also called non-attached, right? They're not aligned with a specific party. When you're thinking of these guys, you need to think about parties such as the Greek Communist Party or like Cinque Stelle in Italy, right? Like the Five-Star Movement. So these are like ones that don't really align with any of these. So these politicians just kind of work on their own, but they're just as active. They vote. They talk during the parliamentary hearings and stuff. So yeah. So basically, that's what it is. Yeah. When it comes to Lithuanian representatives, I already mentioned that we have 11 of them, but as you can see, like majority of them are also focused in the EPP group, so like the Christian Democrats. Then you've got Renew Europe and the Conservatives and SD sort of taking the lead after that. And then you have one representative in the Greens and Petras Gražulis in the Sovereignists. So yeah, but we don't have anyone in the NI, so that's one thing. In general, the parliament has quite a bit of responsibilities. So as I said, the European Commission is the one that proposes laws. So the parliament is the one that amends and votes on these legislative procedures. It also adopts resolutions. It can call on the European Commission to propose legislation. It also oversees the work of the European Commission and EU institutions. The European Commission also happens to be the one that proposes the annual budget. So the Parliament's job is to actually either accept or reject the budget and to monitor the use of the EU funds. And as I noted before, we have like a new commissioner college in place. So the European Parliament is actually the one that accepts the commission. That is to say that every single one of the 27 commissioners goes through this process called the hearings, where basically they sit in the parliament for 3 hours, 4 hours, sometimes even more. And the members of the parliament just interrogate them and ask them a series of questions, everything that they may doubt about the commissioner, to make sure that they're really, really fit for the role. And then they either accept that person or they reject them. One thing that debaters tend to be interested in, and I used to be interested in as a debater, is lobbying, right? Because that matters everywhere, well, no matter what kind of country we choose to talk about, right? So in EU, the interesting thing is if you ever were to step foot in Brussels, you would see this enormous amount of agencies and buildings occupied by agencies that are the lobbyists, right? Now, what we tend to think about is that these are all organizations such as, the big pharma, the digital, and technological companies such as Microsoft and Meta and stuff like that, right? That's not really the case. When it comes to European politics, lobbying basically affects absolutely every single sphere of whatever you can think on, right? You've got massive environmental agencies partaking in the lobbying. You've got healthcare institutions partaking in the lobbying. You've got, I don't know, gender equality institutions, like literally anything you can think of. But the way it works in the parliament, also ignore the slide that says who comprises the Council of the EU. That's my mistake. But anyway, in the world of the EU, lobbyists are actually referred to as interest representatives. They don't really like to call them lobbyists. So they're defined as like any natural or legal person or formal or informal group, association, or network that engages in activities with the objective of influencing the formulation or implementation of policy or legislation or the decision-making process. So in other words, this is any person who is organizing events addressing legislation, participating in consultations with the commission, or writing open letters about current topics, and these individuals can then be considered a lobbyist. It is forbidden actually for the members of parliament to solicit, accept, or receive any direct or indirect benefit or other reward, including cash or in any kind, in exchange for any specific behavior in the scope of the members' parliamentary work. So in the case where the members of the parliament receive a gift or something like that, they're always expected to report it, right? So the members also have to declare gifts that they receive as a result of being an MEP, and especially if this gift is valued 150 euros or more. Currently, we have more than 13,000 organizations and more than 50 people who are officially recognized as interest representatives by the EU. Now, but this number is a little tricky, right? Because it's unclear how many of these are actively engaged in lobbying, because that is to say that this number also includes, like, I don't know, I could be an environmentalist group that had a talk with a member of the parliament, like once 7 years ago, and I'm still considered a part of like this whole organization count, even though, maybe I'm not active anymore and I don't lobby anymore. So the number is really like very iffy. It's hard to decide, whether this is actually the precise number, because some of these might be like, individuals who lobbied only once, so to say. But to enter the European Parliament, interest representatives must be listed on the transparency register. It's basically this catalog that indexes lobbyists, and it displays information such as, what is their interest area, what is it that they'd like to focus on, what is it that, what laws are they interested in, what kind of reforms are they interested in, and stuff like that. But while the registration is mandatory to access the European Parliament, it's like it cannot be enforced to all lobbyists operating beyond the physical premises. So this means that, for instance, if there's conferences organized by think tanks or political groups or media outlets, these can technically be considered occasions of lobbying, but they're not really reported here. So something to keep in mind during your debates, because this whole topic is a little, like tricky. Right. We're going to talk about European Council and Council of the EU. Now, the thing here is that they hold almost the same name, and this makes things really, really complicated because it's really hard to tell apart who does what. So I'm going to try to do my best to explain to you guys how these organizations differ, because they really, really are very different. So right off the bat, we're going to start with the European Council, right? So what is it and how it works? The European Council is comprised of heads of state or governments, right? What does this mean? This means that when the European Council has a meeting, Gitanas Nausėda, the president of Lithuania, is representing us as a country over there. However, this does not apply to every single country, right? So in majority of cases, it's actually the prime ministers who represent the countries in the European Council. So think of, for instance, Italy, right? It's not going to be President Mattarella who's going to go in there and represent Italy in the European Council. Instead, it's going to be Giorgia Meloni who's going to take over the role. The president of the European Council currently is Antonio Costa, and the president sort of serves the role of representing the EU to the outside world. These guys meet 4 times a year, unless there's something urgent and they need to discuss it ASAP, so then they meet more often. And they decide on issues based on consensus, right? But what is the key role that they do? So basically, the European Council is the EU institution that defines the general political direction and priorities of the EU. They do not pass laws, but everything in terms of what are we going to focus on, what is our priority for the next 5 years, is decided by these guys. So this is like the highest level of political cooperation between EU countries. And they oftentimes will have to deal with complex issues that cannot be resolved at lower levels of intergovernmental cooperation. And these are also the guys who set the common foreign and security policy, right? So European Council, heads of state, set the path for EU future, right? Makes sense. Now, the Council of the EU, that's a whole lot different. So the Council of the EU is comprised of member states' ministers and heads of government, right? So for instance, Paluckas, like the Prime Minister of Lithuania, would go on to meet with other members of the Council of the EU. The Council of the EU, therefore, represents the governments of the member states, okay? So during the meetings in Brussels and Luxembourg, the ministers discuss a large variety of EU matters, and these topics really, really vary. This can be agriculture, fisheries, foreign policy, legal systems, justice, etc., etc., etc. And this council, together with the European Parliament, takes decisions on legislative acts, right? So, European Council, presidents, yada, yada, set the path. Council of the EU represent the governments, and they're the guys who actually pass and amend laws, okay? So these guys have a more like hands-on job of like, agreeing or not agreeing with what the Commission proposes. One thing I'd like you to know here is there's this concept of the presidency of the council. So every 6 months, there's going to be a different country who will take over the presidency of the Council of the EU. The members hold this presidency together in close groups of threes. These are called the trios, and these trios set the long-term goals and prepare a common agenda for the EU. So currently what we have in place, we have Poland, which holds the presidency, and it's as of right now in a trio with Denmark and Cyprus. So why holding the presidency matters is because you get to push things that actually matter to you as a country, and you get to like tell other countries and be like, hey, this is really important. I'd like you to pay attention to this, right? So when we're looking at the presidency of Poland, what we see is a massive focus on defense and resilience, right? For these guys, they put forward these key things as like their priorities. It's defense and security, protection of people and borders, resistance to foreign interference and disinformation, ensuring security and freedom of business, energy transition, competitive and resilient agriculture, and health security, right? So very, very much issues that are kind of tend to be like maybe perhaps more specific or more important to Poland compared to like maybe other countries, right? What matters here is that in 2027, Lithuania is actually going to be having the presidency of the Council of the EU, and we're going to be in a trio with Ireland and Greece. So the presidency is sort of responsible for driving the council's work. You know, these are the guys who will chair the meetings and stuff like that. They ensure the continuity of the EU agenda, and that there's orderly legislative process, and that the member states are actually cooperating. But as I noted before, the thing that matters here is that they're able to put a spotlight on an issue that the country maybe has specific expertise in, right? So even in the case of Lithuania, you know, given our geopolitical situation, our geographical location, the fact that we're right next to Poland as well, defense and resilience are also probably going to be some of the issues that we're going to be putting forward. So hopefully you got to understand this part and how we differ. One thing, a side note that I'd like you to note, there's also this thing called the Council of Europe, okay? I don't know why they name everything the same, but it is what it is. The Council of Europe is a completely different thing again, because the Council of Europe is the continent's leading human rights organization, right? So when we're talking politics, we're talking only about the European Council and the Council of the EU, okay? And the Council of Europe is a whole other thing that we keep to the side, okay? Perfect. Right. Now that we've moved on from talking about the institutions and we've established the key differences, let's go on to talk about making laws. Before that, are there any questions or anything like that? Okay, I'll take silence as a no. So we can go on and talk about other things. So how EU laws are made, right? I'll try to be as clear here as possible. If anything, stop me and intervene and ask me what's not clear. But basically, the way this works is this. European Commission plans, prepares, and proposes new legislation. It can also do so if one of the councils or the EP requests the Commission to propose a new legislation, or if there's been a European Citizens Initiative that's been so successful that it's been put to the attention of European Commission and now it has to propose a law. So once it's done doing that, the European Commission publishes the legislative proposal, then citizens and stakeholders can provide feedback, and then the EC submits the proposal to the European Parliament and the Council of the EU for adoption. What happens then is the EP and Council review the legislation and propose amendments. So typically, the Parliament and the Council and the Commission then meet to like discuss the amendments and see whether they agree or not. And if the Commission does not agree with any of the amendments proposed by the Council and the EP, the Council can only overrule the objection by unanimous decision. However, if the Commission considers that these amendments like excessively change the purpose of the legislation and they're just too much, it also has the right to just withdraw the legislation and not have it go on, right? But if the three institutions do not agree on a common final text, we go into a second reading stage, right? This means that the Parliament and Council then propose further new amendments to the whole legislation, and Parliament can also block the proposal if it doesn't agree with the Council. But then if the second reading doesn't go well, and no one can agree once again, you have this thing called a conciliation committee. It's like an external organ that comes in and tries to help and find a solution, right? So long story short, I made a beautiful graph for you guys, right? Pretty fantastic, very cutesy. So just to visualize it, right? You've got the European Council, heads of state. They set the general priorities. They realize they figure out what it is that we want to focus on in the next years, right? The European Commission then takes into account these priorities, takes into account its own priorities, and proposes new laws, right? The Parliament and the Council create amendments if they need to. If not, they just immediately accept the law. Then they bring those back to the Commission, right? And the Commission either agrees or not. And finally, when everyone is in agreement, you have new legislature adopted, right? We've got a new law. But if nothing works, if no one can come into an agreement, no one agrees with each other's amendments, we go into a second reading. And then if that doesn't work, we have this external body that comes in and tries to help us deal with the situation to make the law pass. Yeah, aside from that, there's also this other thing called the secondary legislative procedure. I'm not going to go into that because I can also see that we don't have that much time. But the thing with the secondary legislative procedure, it's basically this like a whole another method being used in very unique cases. So for instance, if there's been like a very serious violation of fundamental rights, or if there, for instance, we're deciding on whether to enlarge the EU and accept a new member state into the European Union, what will happen is that we will take part in the special legislative procedure, which is basically when the council is the only legislator, right? And instead, the parliament is either consenting to the commission's proposal or it's being consulted on the proposal, okay? I'm not going to go into much detail because this isn't as common. This ordinary legislative procedure is something that you should be keeping your eyes on. This is the key thing of how majority of policies happen, right? But just as a side note, know that this thing exists and once upon a time it's being used, okay? So, right. Now that we've figured that out, hopefully, now that we've figured out how laws are made, we need to talk about the types of EU legal acts, right? So two types to take into account here. You've got primary law and you've got secondary law. Now, primary law is basically EU treaties. Notably, these are the Treaty of Rome and Treaty of Maastricht. So there's basically, okay, the way this works is basically this. When you join the European Union, right, you already signed some treaties, but some treaties are changed over time because there's new countries joining in and stuff like that, right? So these fundamental laws that you guys agreed on are changing, right? So treaties are the starting point for EU law, and therefore they're being referred to as the primary law. But the EU can only pass laws in the policy areas where the member states have authorized it to do it. So, okay, and this is what we call the principle of conferral, right? This means that basically the EU will only pass laws in situations where all member states have agreed, right? So in general, we all rest on the primary law, which is the EU treaties, but then the primary law allows us to move on to the secondary law, which is more likely what you're going to be seeing in debates. So the secondary law is basically the body of law that comes from the principles and objectives of the treaties. And this includes legislative and non-legislative acts, right? But the thing you need to care about is the legislative acts, right? And we've got 5 different types. You've got regulations, directives, decisions, recommendations, and opinions. Legislative acts are basically decisions adopted following one of the legislative procedures set out by the EU treaties, right? So either the ordinary or the special legislative procedure that we talked about. Now, these 5 things, at least that's what I used to find really confusing when I was debating, is that they look the same and it's really hard to understand, you know, like whether they really have an impact or like whether they're just out there. So I'm going to try to explain this very concisely to you guys on how these things differ. First things first, you have got regulations, right? Regulations are basically legal acts that are binding in their entirety. So they're directly and uniformly applicable to all EU member states as soon as they enter into force without needing it for it to be transposed into national laws. Like the Commission, EP, and Council pass it, and it's immediately enforced in Lithuania, okay? Then you've got directives. So directives set binding objectives upon EU member states to achieve a certain result, but it's basically free for each state has freedom to choose how it's going to do so, right? So the way it works, is that you're sort of given an objective that you need to achieve. Say, for instance, I don't know, it can be like a sustainability directive that we're going to be, not producing XYZ of like oil in our country, right? But the way that we get to it would be on us to decide. The thing to note here is that in that case, this means that the EU member states must adopt the measures to incorporate the directive into a national law. And this is what we call the transposing. Okay. So when you take in the EU national law and you put the EU law and you put it into your national law, this whole process of adaptation is called transposing, something for your debate knowledge as well. Then you've got decisions. Decisions are binding in their entirety, right? But a decision specifies to whom it is addressed, and it will be binding only to those countries to which it is addressed, right? So it can be a decision, for instance, only for Poland and Hungary to like, I don't know, maybe do something relating to like women's rights or something like that, right? So it's not going to apply to everyone. And then you've got these two guys. It's recommendations and opinions. So they're not binding, but there is a difference between them. So recommendations basically allow EU institutions to make their views known and to suggest a line of action, but without it being obligatory, right? So the European Commission can look at me and I'm like, I don't know, maybe Latvia, and they'll be like, oh, I'm not really liking the way you're doing XYZ. Maybe you should try changing it by doing ABC, but I don't necessarily have to accept it. But with an opinion, it's a little different because it's basically just the institution stating its opinion. It's legit what it is. It's just an instrument that allows institutions to make a statement in a non-binding fashion and without imposing any legal obligation to behave in a certain way or to do anything specific. Right. So I hope we got this a little out of the way and it's clearer. And now you understand that, like recommendations or opinions are like a sort of a whole different thing. It's just more like legit, just like it's not binding or anything, right? It's still important, but it's not binding. But the three key guys, the regulations, directives, and decisions are the ones that the countries usually need to pay more attention to. Yeah, actually, this is the last slide. So Slay, we made it. But when we talk about all these things, it's also critical to talk about the areas of EU action. So you've got three principles, right, that the EU laws are based on. You've got the principle of conferral, proportionality, and subsidiarity, right? These are super important. So basically, the principle of conferral means that the EU has only that authority conferred upon it by the EU treaties, which have been ratified by all member states, okay? So only if all countries signed it, the EU can do something. Then you've got the principle of proportionality, which means that the EU cannot exceed what is necessary to achieve the objectives of the treaties, right? It cannot take up more responsibility than it needs to. And then you've got subsidiarity, which means that in areas where either the EU or national governments can act, the EU may intervene only if it can act more effectively. If not, if the member state like France can do things on its own pretty well, then the EU is not going to be involved, right? So once you understand that, you've got the three different competence areas, right? What competencies means is that in some areas, EU is able to pass laws alone. In some, it has to cooperate with national governments. In others, it's only the national governments doing things. So there's basically like a set of rules that applies to all. Exclusive competences basically mean that the role of member countries is limited to applying the law, and unless the EU authorizes them to adopt certain laws themselves. So basically, EU is adapting laws on its own in this case, right? What this means, it's basically areas such as the customs union, competition rules for a single market, monetary policy, obviously, if it's zero. It's also trade and international agreements. And there's this fifth aspect, which is a little weird. It's marine plants and animals regulated by the common fisheries policy. It's a bit of a unique situation, but regardless. But basically, it's mainly things relating to like international trade, international agreements, right? Situations in which the EU needs to act as a whole. So therefore, in those situations, the EU has the exclusive competence. Then you've got the shared competences. So in certain areas, both the EU and member countries are able to pass laws, but the countries can only do so if the EU has not already proposed laws or has decided that it will not. So these are the shared competencies, right? Both pass laws. These are things like, employment and social affairs, economic, social, territorial cohesion, agriculture, fisheries, and environment, right? Situations in which both the EU acts together with member states when enacting laws. And then lastly, you've got supporting competencies. This means that EU can only support, coordinate, or complement the actions of member countries. It has no power to pass laws. That whole thing is onto the member states to do. And this is a variety of areas where the EU is simply like supporting the member states. So this can be public health, culture, tourism, industry, education and training, youth and sports, kind of things. Right. So I'm pretty sure that that's kind of the core of it all. I hope you guys got it. I hope you guys understood it. I know that it's not the most exciting topic, but it really is something you need to keep an eye on, especially given that also, as European citizens, this is something that matters to us, how laws are made. So, does anyone have any questions? And these can be, in your opinion, stupid questions. There's no such thing. Ask me anything that, maybe is a little unclear.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to tell you that it was actually very, very interesting. I don't know, I didn't really know anything about the EU, like in that big of a scope. So it was actually very, very interesting. So don't worry about that. And I think it can really be applied into the big knowledge because in the past year, I've come across a few motions that involved EU and especially the European Parliament. So it was really interesting. Thank you for this workshop.
You're so welcome. I'm very glad to hear that this was helpful. I mean, I just remember that sure, I happen to do my master's in European politics, so now I kind of understand these things. But even to this day, so many of these things are just so confusing, especially like the way things are labeled and the fact that, like some institutions basically have the same name. But I remembered being in high school and doing debating, and it's just really difficult to grasp how certain institutions behave because their areas of competence and their areas of actions tend to like overlay one another. So yeah, so I'm happy to hear that it was helpful. If you guys have no further questions, thank you so much for joining. That will be all. If
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, my bad. Let me just stop sharing the screen then, and I will get right on it. Okay, to what extent can lobbying influence the law passing process, and in which specific stage of that process do they have the most capacity, right? Good question. Really, really depends. See, the thing is, this isn't like, I think when we're talking about lobbying and when we're talking about lobbying and debating specifically, we tend to think about things like, the National Rifle Association in the US because it's the easiest example. But it doesn't really work like that. It's much more basic in a sense of that you as a representative of, I don't know, for instance, Meta, right? You're just simply meeting up with members of specific political parties or having conversations with specific committees and it's very open to the public. At least it's supposed to be, right? So technically, each time that you have a meeting of a member of the parliament or anything like that, it needs to be recorded in the transparency registry. That means that you have to state what it is what policies are you trying to influence and stuff like that, and what is it that you're interested in, right? So technically, to some extent, sure, you're able to influence that process, but it's really difficult because at the end of the day, the lobbyists are not meeting with all members of the parliament, and the people within it are being influenced by very different lobbying groups. So I wouldn't say that it's that common to really pass it. But yeah, for sure they have an influence. It's just the fact that, in EU in general, attention is always being placed on transparency and anti-corruption things. So it's the EU institutions are doing the best to like oversee the whole process to make sure that no one is, like getting unsolicited gifts or anything like that. Another thing I'd like you to note maybe is that, think about situations where you do have huge lobby agencies and lobby clusters in Brussels, but they don't really succeed, right? One of the best examples of this is think about Google, right? A couple of years back, there was a huge competitiveness trial placed based on the fact that Google was being very unfair in the way it marketed its products compared to other companies' products, the way it overshadowed specific like other for instance websites and stuff like that. And Google also, like as any tech industry can have its own lobby, but clearly at the end of the day there isn't that much that can be done because the competitiveness laws and everything else, they oversee the whole situation and they try their best to prevent it. So for sure lobbying does have an influence. Does it have the influence to the extent that it can lead to like proper passing of laws? I really doubt it. I at least I personally don't happen to know any situations like that. But it doesn't mean that won't happen in the future. So yeah. Right. Okay. Well, if you guys don't have any further questions, I guess that will be all. I'm gonna go make a cup of tea because I have a sore throat. It was lovely talking to you. I hope this was useful, and that will be all. Have a lovely evening, you guys.